Hi, welcome to Beyond. Dr. Sandie Morgan is the director of the Global Center for Women and Justice at Vanguard University and is recognized globally for expertise in combating human trafficking and working to end violence against women. She has served on the Foreign Affairs Chair with Congressman Ed Royce, Anti-Human Trafficking Advisory Committee. She also serves the Orange County CSEC, which is the Commercial Sexual Exploitation of Children Steering Committee, partnering with Child Welfare and Juvenile Justice. She has launched a certified 4-class, 12-unit program in human trafficking designed for people out there in the field. Dr. Morgan, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, so glad to have you on the show. And, you know, this is a very, it's a tough issue. And I know that I've come to learn more about it over time. But the idea of human trafficking in 2019 is just really hard to get one's head around. But the reality is it's very real. In fact, I read that human trafficking is only second to drug trade or drug trafficking in terms of revenues and profits that it generates.
Exactly. And that's why it's called trafficking. Some people are not really, don't clearly understand why it's called trafficking, but it falls in the category of crime that makes a profit from illegal weapon sales, illegal drug sales, and it's not legal to sell people.
Right. And it's sort of like the whack-a-mole strategy. So the government says we're going to put a lot of pressure on the drug trade. So the bad guys just say, okay, fine, we're going to figure out another way to make the profit. But before we jump into that, I find your career and your progression and your life story very fascinating, right? And so take us back to the early life that led up to your career. Can you share some stories that got your journey started?
I have to give my dad, who is long gone now, a lot of credit because he raised me to always be looking for what you can do to help the underdog. And I remember being at a baseball game, just an intramural sports game, and one team came from a more favorable neighborhood and had lots of brand new equipment, and the other team didn't. And so we chose which team we were sitting on their side by who needed the most encouragement.
Nice.
So my dad kind of started that in me.
So that's what got you on the pathway of really helping others, whether it be, and I think you were a nurse at one time.
I was a pediatric night nurse for a couple of years, and that's when I first engaged with a victim of commercial sexual exploitation of children. I admitted a 14-year-old boy at 2 a.m. and his mother and stepfather were selling him for drugs. And that never left me. That's before we had the Trafficking Victims Protection Act federally or here in California. But the same model, the same reason, the same risk factors exist today. Parents who had a family member with a drug problem and a vulnerable child.
Now, how did you know when this kid walked in that he was in that category? Was it obvious, or did you have to ask some probing questions?
Well, actually, because of the trauma, he was brought in because of trauma injuries.
I see.
From being sold for sex. And if you can imagine, just when we talk about victims of human trafficking, the trauma that they experience to their own body and to their mind and their soul is very multidimensional. It takes a big team to address all of that.
Oh, that's heavy. I mean, I can't imagine that. So you mentioned your father and some of the lessons he taught you. What are some of the lessons that you learned in your early life that you applied to your professional, progression? And I mean, you're a PhD and you really have a very strong hand in this issue of human trafficking. But if you take the audience back, what were some of the lessons you learned early on that said, it was profound and it really shaped you as the woman you are today and the track you took?
Well, let me go back to when I was in high school then. People don't ask me these kind of questions. I love this, Ben. And I was a prolific writer. I wrote a lot of satire. I always had a very witty response. And usually, even though I was pretty small, I could cut anybody down to size. And one summer, I was reading the Old Testament, and Proverbs 10:19 just struck me. And it's probably not a verse that rolls off everybody's tongue, but it says in the old version, When words are many, sin is not absent. And that made me a much stronger observer and listener. And I quit writing. I came back to my senior year in high school, and my English teacher was devastated because I quit writing all those fun things. But I became very good at listening and keeping notes. I have notebooks and stacks of observations, but I've never written anything that I've published because I always feel like there's so much more I need to learn before I can put something into black and white print. So, yeah.
So it's really powerful and profound what you just said, because the Bible also says that words have the power of life and death. And what you said was, I'm a person of relatively short stature, although I think you're a giant to many. But you realize in early age that words can destroy and tear down. And we look at social media today and what's going on in America, and just the hate that's out there, and the idea that maybe people feel disempowered or powerless, but behind a computer in an anonymity state, they can just say the most awful, crazy things. And I think what you're saying is very profound, because when we think about the dialogue in America, it's really completely unnecessary. The things that people get worked up about, really, in America, if you want to compare it to the rest of the world and how other people live and their issues, it's interesting. I don't know what to make of it, because I know it's not simple as just watch what you say. It's always complicated issues. But what you said kind of pierces through that veil of, hey, when you speak, you got to be thoughtful.
And to that end, that kind of drove how I began to approach human trafficking, because I saw so many people go in and raise lots of money telling a story, but then not having a best practice model for a strategy to use that money for education. So my mantra is study the issues, be a voice, make a difference. Because if you don't spend some time studying and you just find out about the issue and start going off, you can cause harm. You can hurt people. You can hurt programs that have been in existence for decades, helping the very people that are the most vulnerable. And your very charismatic presentation on human trafficking convinces supporters to now support you, and they quit supporting that after-school program or that community development program in a village in Southeast Asia.
Right. Yeah, so that's powerful. So as I think about your progression, as I mentioned, your educational pursuits have taken you from nursing to education to spirituality to a PhD in intercultural studies. What are the threads in your mind that connect those educational disciplines?
I think as I became more aware that the rest of the world didn't grow up the way I did. My dad, I remember when I was 9 years old, and he told me, if you want to be president of the United States, you can. And he looked at my brother, a year younger, and said, so can you. So there was never this, you're a girl, you have to do this. You're a boy, you have to do that. And then I went to other parts of the world, and it wasn't like that. And I had to sit in a different section, and I didn't have the same opportunities. And I couldn't speak in some meetings because I'm a woman. I don't get that.
That's crazy.
So I started looking at domestic violence, child abuse, and began to see how some of our cultural norms, our traditions, actually preserve a patriarchy that lends itself to support abuse. And I decided that I had to start speaking up, especially on child abuse, when I was living in Greece. And the more I learned, the more I began to understand that giving women more rights was really important. I discovered that if a woman left because she was getting beaten, that she had no right to her children. The laws have changed now, but not when I was there. And that was part of our advocacy, speaking up to make a difference.
Wow, it's great that you took that experience, whereas some perhaps women would say, I don't have a voice, and I'm going to be angry and shout from the mountaintops. But you took that and then you devised a strategy how to make it a negative into a positive. And I think we need more of that. So let's talk a little bit more about human trafficking. What is human trafficking?
Human trafficking is really has like three basic elements. The action is someone recruits, harbors, transports another person, And then the means is through force, fraud, or coercion. And in the state of California, we add extortion for the purpose of a commercial sex act or labor and services. And it's really important to understand that the defining nature of this is someone else is profiting from another human being. It is in the same category as slavery. Often we talk about our history of indentured servitude, and it's been in the media a lot lately, the release of 1619 report, talking about when some of the first slaves brought from Africa landed in America. And understanding that this issue has been with us, but in 2000, we passed a federal version of that law so that we have teeth to respond to those elements when we see force, fraud, or coercion.
And that's on a federal, or is it on a state level?
Force, fraud, and coercion is federal, and on the state level, it's force, fraud, coercion, and extortion.
Okay, good. So, much has been written and reported. In fact, I was recently going through Atlanta Airport, and I heard overhead a little announcement on human trafficking. And having interviewed Deidre, I was like, it obviously caused me to pay attention. And I thought that was very cool. But there's a lot been written about it, yet the issue of human trafficking, in my mind, in my experience, seems to barely elicit a reaction for most Americans, right? They don't really connect what it really is. So why do you think that is?
Partly it's how we live, and we're very focused on our own stuff, and it doesn't relate to us. So when it does come into our sight, we feel bad. We watch something. I had somebody take a picture and send it to me because at the John Wayne Airport here, the posters are up on human trafficking, and they were really excited. They knew I'd be excited.
Sure.
And more we're seeing that, but people don't really understand how to respond, and they don't connect where they fit in the story. So it's pretty much like watching a TV program, and then you turn it off and you go on to the next thing.
Right. And it's tough because we're getting bombarded with stuff every day, problems to solve and issues out there. What are the signs or the typical signs of human trafficking?
When you're looking at human trafficking, you're going to be looking for somebody who is always looking to the person who's in charge before they speak to you. They may not have their own documents. It may look like it's a really off situation. Somebody who says, I'm her uncle, and they don't even look remotely alike. There are a lot of discrepancies, and something doesn't feel right. A lot of the problem in reporting is that people feel like they have to have all the elements before they call the hotline, which the hotline is 888-3737-888. But you can call if you just have a gut instinct that something doesn't seem right. I had a friend text me the other day. She saw two really young Asian girls with an older white male go into a residence, and then cars keep pulling up. It's like, yeah, call and report
that's
that.
A sign, yeah.
And we may not get a full case out of that, but we start to accumulate data that establishes trends so that then we focus more resources in those neighborhoods. And the traffickers depend on people not being observant.
Right.
If you go to a restaurant where the people that are working there never leave because they live on the premises, that's not normal. Do you live at your job? Well, your wife probably thinks so, but so knowing that something isn't quite right, but not having to know what to do about it, you just call the National Human Trafficking Resource.
And what's that number again?
888-3737-888.
Good. That's important. How prevalent is human trafficking in Orange County?
Since our task force began, we have recovered and served over 1,000 victims of human trafficking. A large number have been sex trafficking, but we also have served foreign nationals from 39 countries. We've served minors, children. I always correct myself minors is more of a legal term, but my friend Judge Doug Hachimonji was on my podcast once, and he said, these are children, and we're going to keep calling them children because it's easy to dismiss a number marker, but a child is a child, and we have a great responsibility, not just as parents, but as a community, to protect the most vulnerable, and children fall in that category.
You know, it was odd to me as I was doing more research on human trafficking and sex trafficking. I think a lot of people in America view sex trafficking as prostitution. These are women who have made a choice for whatever reason to do that. And the reality is we're talking about kids as young as I've read as 12, 14 that are coerced and forced into this. I mean, they're offered getting their hair done, nails done, Gucci bags, whatever, and they're forced into this. And these are victims. These are not intentional, these are not intentional actions from kids. Not that they could even think clearly about these issues at 12 and 14, but these are not prostitutes in the regular sense of the word. These are victims that are forced into this and completely abused.
And the wonderful part about our law is you don't have to prove force, fraud, or coercion if the victim is under 18, because we know that a child's brain development has not matured. And so one of the challenges our law enforcement have when they try to recover 14, 15-year-old victims is they feel like they're doing what they have to do and they don't want to be rescued. That's so counterintuitive for many people, but they believe that they're doing what they have to do to survive. They believe often that they're complicit, and they weren't actually forced in most cases. They were lured into this and then manipulated and coerced and eventually completely trapped through the threats, the coercion.
Sure.
This is what's going to happen to your family if you leave.
Right. That's just crazy. What drives the demand for human trafficking in Orange County?
Oh, me and you. The demand for human trafficking, you have to look at it from two perspectives. I know Deidre talked about demand when it comes to sex trafficking. And if you think of a law and supply triangle, you have a product and then you have a seller. But without demand, it collapses.
Without the buyer, right.
So who is the buyer in Orange County? Who is the buyer? Well, the buyer is online, and you can look on our Orange County Human Trafficking Task Force website to see where they have done investigations in beautiful parts of our county. So it isn't something happening in a back street all the time. It's happening right there.
In the wealthiest neighborhoods.
But it won't continue unless there is demand, unless somebody is
Correct.
calling and saying, I want a, quote, date with a 15-year-old Asian. I mean, it's like ordering pizza. Mm-hmm. The other half of demand is we are a disposable society. We want cheap stuff. We also want somebody else to wash our cars, clean our houses, and do our yards for us. And so the idea that labor trafficking is 4 times as prevalent as sex trafficking, that's when it gets harder to feel really compelled to do something, because that means you're compelled to study that.
Well, and then there's an economic piece, right? That people say, hey, I want a better deal, I want it cheaper, and maybe it forces them to look the other way, right?
Yeah. And we don't want to give up some things, and I'm not advocating that you have to give up your iPhone because of the mineral that is mined by children on the west coast of Africa. But we do have to start using the tools. Department of Labor created this great app. You're going to have to get it. Sweat and Toil. It has thousands of pages of research. You go in the store, you look at the label on the bananas, and then, because it always tells you what country they're from, you put that country in and bananas, and it tells you with little symbols if children are not in school because they're harvesting bananas.
And what's the name of the app?
Sweat and Toil.
Sweat and Toil app.
So when I talk to people, I want to give them a tool they can use right now to begin to raise their consciousness about their own complicity in driving demand.
Serenitex is focused on eliminating the biggest challenge to migraine management, namely the subjective diagnosis of migraines and standard migraine drug therapy that results in undesirable effects and unproven results. Healthcare and lost productivity costs from migraines is $78 billion a year, and employers lose 113 million lost workdays from migraines. But did you know that more than 95% of those with chronic migraines have never sought help, received a diagnosis, or been treated? Serenitex has discovered a patentable technology solution for the non-invasive detection and screening of migraines. We've tested our approach on actual migraine patients, and it works. To learn more, visit serenitex.com.
What would you say is the biggest myth of human trafficking?
It's over there is one of the big myths. We don't really have it here. The other big myth is that it is predominantly sex trafficking, and some people who haven't studied the issues before they start talking quote really old statistics. I was someplace where somebody said that our middle school children, 1 in 3 or something, are being trafficked, and those are really myths that continue to be perpetuated because somebody a long time ago did a speech where they were just extrapolating because we didn't have data, and they keep using that over and over again. So I think understanding how to do the research to find out what the truth is in your community is important.
Really, really important. So we talked about it's not only just sex trafficking, but it's an economic source of trafficking. So how does human trafficking impact business competitiveness?
Oh, I love that question. That's my favorite, because I think when we start looking at how this hits our own pocketbook, we're going to step up. So consider a colleague who came to me because he began experiencing challenges when he was submitting bids for projects because another company was underbidding him regularly. I sent him to talk to DOL because there was a very strong chance this would be a good investigation, because the other company was hiring a third-party contractor that actually was using slave labor. And often,
how do you compete with that?
Yeah, because they're going to offer a better price. So one of my friends, when I first started talking about human trafficking, she came to me with tears in her eyes, and she said, I can't believe it. I pay $85 a month to have my front and backyard done every week. And a truck shows up with anywhere from 4 to 8 guys. They're there for 45 minutes. Do the math. Is anybody even getting minimum wage?
Right.
No, just do the math. Ask yourself. I have another friend from Department of Labor who won't eat at a Chinese all-you-can-eat buffet because he said for $7, somebody's not getting paid. You have to ask yourself if you are actually contributing to demand for those kinds of cheap labor and products right here in our own community.
That's a great insight and perspective, because oftentimes you're just going around saying, "Yeah, it was a great deal, great food, go check out this place," and you don't look at the underbelly or the reality of what's going on with those people.
That's right.
Yeah, and it can be challenging.
I think what I want people to understand is we have easily accessible education. So nobody has to leave their job. I have students who want to change their major, and I love teaching at Vanguard. My interns end up working directly in the field as a probation officer, as a human trafficking investigator with Homeland Security, as child welfare policy advocates. But it starts with figuring out where you fit in the approach to ending modern day slavery.
Exactly.
I think one of the things I learned from Wilberforce was how he used overlapping networks. And we don't go in our own lane and do our own thing. We have to integrate. We have to work cross-sector. We have to work cross-culturally. And we need to learn how to share information. The person who has the most doesn't win in the end.
Right.
They just keep dropping it because they can't handle it all.
Right. You can't take it with you, right?
No.
Yeah, no question about that. So we talked about labor trafficking, sex trafficking. What is the impact of pornography in driving the demand curve for sex trafficking?
Well, if you have a product that you're trying to sell, you have to absolutely create a budget for marketing that product. But if you're selling commercial sex, you don't need to do that because the pornography industry does it for you. And if you look at some of the numbers online, the pornography industry is huge. The amount of money they rake in every year, apparently, according to some of the reports that I've read, exceeds the combined revenue of all of our sports, basketball, baseball,
I didn't know
football.
that. Wow.
Isn't that amazing? I mean, that is a huge industry that exploits some of the most vulnerable. And you will hear the industry talk about how well they treat their actors, but you will also find that there are a lot of people who have been in that industry that became very broken, left with huge amounts of trauma physically,
Sure.
emotionally, and spiritually. And even though supposedly producing pornography is only legal for adults, children are implicated. And then it drives more demand for younger and younger victims. Right. And if you watch adult porn, which I don't recommend anybody do that, you also begin to see how the visualizations, even if it is an adult, personifies a child, which drives demand for child commercial sexual exploitation. And I never want to hear people use the terminology child prostitution. That's an oxymoron.
Right.
It's not possible. But using the CSEC term, and I was so proud of you that you did that at the very beginning of the show. It's a big word, commercial sexual exploitation of children, but it defines what it is. It is for profit. Nobody starts a commercial industry without making money in mind. And then sexual exploitation, it is an explanation of what happens to them. And the word exploitation is a financial term.
Right.
And then children. It's about our kids.
It's scary, the whole thing with pornography and what drives it. And to me, it's clearly defining deviancy downward. It's taking what were just outrageous concepts and normalizing them. And when you normalize it, and you don't have people with a value system. In this culture, if you talk about God or you talk about a value system, people sort of brush back and say, who are you to judge or define? Well, it's not about judging or defining, but eventually you got to have something you got to believe in. And if you have nothing you believe in and you're letting people that, push pornography or other things, other vices, dominate your conscience and how you construct your life, that's a big problem. It's a big problem because they're unwitting accomplices, if you will, and they don't really recognize the impact they're having on other people and certainly in their own lives. And this isn't to be preachy or moralistic, it's just a fact, because the people that pick up those pieces are the social workers that then go back and say, so let's talk about your choices and let's talk about how those choices impacted your life, your kids' life, because I would argue that pornography, beyond just human sex trafficking, etc., for those people that are hyper engaged in it, absolutely affect their direct family. Their aunts, uncles, cousins, you name it. And so the idea that we can do this in a vacuum is just is bonkers.
And
it's not real.
It contributes to the breakup of families.
Absolutely.
It contributes to familial child sexual abuse.
Right.
All of those
exactly.
things.
Which, when those kids get abused, it's a downward spiral unless you have help come in and step in to sort of redirect it. So one of the things as I was studying this that really shocked me, and I'm going to ask a question, I'm going to bring up a story that happened locally, but I was curious, why are the systems in most states designed to deal with human trafficking? It's like a revolving door for the victims. So they get them off the streets, but they can't force them to stay there. And there was a girl, I believe, in Yorba Linda that was 14 that was brought into this system. And then she got coerced or threatened by her John, whoever was managing her. And she left, and that night she ended up dead in front of $1 million home. There's a big story. I think it was in Yorba Linda or somewhere. Yep. That's nuts. I mean, she was saved, and yet the system isn't designed to protect this 14-year-old girl. Help us understand that.
Well, can we start over and we'll just do the whole show about Aubriana is her name. Beautiful young woman. Yes, she was rescued. That was right after we passed the CASE Act. And this is such a good example of when people are really passionate and it sounds really good, but they didn't do their homework. The CASE Act changed these kids being picked up on juvenile prostitution, where we had a very deep pool of resources to keep them safe and to do rehabilitation. And overnight, we don't arrest them now. We don't pull them in. And our juvenile justice program is built on rehabilitation. It's not punitive like criminal justice. So under the old law, Aubriana would have gone to juvenile detention when she was rescued. Under the new law, she went to a youth shelter because now she's a victim, not a perpetrator. And because of that, our youth shelters are safe. No one can get in, but they are not secure. And we cannot restrain a child that wants to leave at that age. So she left with her, with staff there saying, please don't go, please don't go. And staff they'll like take a bus with a child to try to get them to change their mind. But the pimp had threatened her mother and her sister. And she said, I have to go. And of course, now you know the rest of the story. Media doesn't help us. In the beginning, they clearly identified Aubriana as a victim of commercial sexual exploitation of children. And her pimp was prosecuted and convicted and sentenced of commercial sexual exploitation of a child. But the person who murdered her was convicted of homicide. And when the media, and I won't name names, printed this in their papers, they called her a prostitute, a teen prostitute. And media has to start helping communicate because they shape
Was
how
that intentional
society.
or was that inadvertent?
Inadvertent because they don't have overlapping networks. And so homicide reporters didn't have the same training that the juvenile justice reporter had. So they need to have everything across the board. Everybody needs to understand.
So we can name it for what it is.
And I
Characterize
wrote lots of letters to the newspaper about that. Yeah. But I still believe that Aubriana's case is a great example of when people vote with their hearts and they don't really understand the issues. 81% of Californians voted with their hearts on a referendum that, because of the way we do law in California, it's not as easy to adapt as when it just comes through normal Senate and Assembly.
Right. So when someone comes to human trafficking or sex trafficking, what are the two biggest needs of a girl? And this could also include men or boys, or a woman who have left trafficking and is trying to make a new life. What are the two biggest needs they have?
Oh, wow. Okay, let's look at physical and psycho-spiritual, I suppose. Sure. Break it into those. Physically, they need a safe place that is not an institutionalized housing. They need to be part of a family. We are hardwired to be part of a family, and we have survivors, victims that have just been rescued, that go back to their old place because they were part of a family. Dysfunctional, horrible, but it was still their family. Mm-hmm. They're in an institution now. There's 8 beds. There's the shift changes every 8 hours. It's not as family centered, and they crave that family, so they go back. So that kind of recidivism is a big problem. Secondly, they need a job, and they are not going to be able to survive on working in a fast food restaurant on part-time hours. They're just like me and you. And I'm constantly, I try to provide gap scholarships for survivors to come to Vanguard University, where they have a lot of that family community support, so they have a better chance of finishing than going to like a 22,000 student community college.
Yeah.
And but housing is always my biggest challenge. How can I find affordable housing that isn't institutionalized, and so they can have a normal life? So housing and jobs, and then psychologically they need long-term trauma-informed therapy. And that means that we can't like say, well, we've got 90 days of counseling for you.
Yeah.
And when that's done, what happens? Yeah. So this is one of my questions. I've been throwing it out there, and I think UCI is going to pick it up and do the research. But one of my big questions is, how much money do we spend to put the bad guy away in a place where he gets 3 meals a day and access to free education, by the way.
Not close to 100,000?
Probably, yeah.
80
And
to
then
100?
how much do we put into the aftercare for the survivor?
Right.
If we put him away for 5 years, can't we support her for 5 years?
Yeah.
It's got to be balanced.
So what advice would you give somebody who's lived this life of chaos, confusion, and doesn't know how to get their bearings in life? What advice would you give that person?
Wow.
Because it's chaotic in their head, right? It's like, which way's up?
I would advise them to get connected. They need to be part of a community because they can't do this on their own. They can't wait until they've got it all together to start reaching out to achieve their goals. They need to be part of a community. And here in Orange County, we have lots of opportunities for that. We have a really diverse Orange County Human Trafficking Task Force. But in other communities, it's also very possible to find your people, other survivors, communities that understand the issues and know how to support you.
Right, and navigate, because it's got to be just bloody confusing.
We have volunteers on the Orange County Human Trafficking Task Force that all they do is say, I'll be here to drive you to your appointments. They don't have a car, they're taking a bus, they miss an appointment, counts against them. They've got to go to DMV, they don't know how to navigate that, so they leave because the whole trauma thing, trauma interrupts how you process things.
Right, and unresolved trauma that only I would imagine metastasizes and grows over time makes it even worse, I would think.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
I just did a few weeks ago a podcast on trauma and how to know when someone has trauma in the workplace. And sometimes when we do get jobs, our survivors aren't able to keep the job because they need a little extra support. Somebody who is having a hard time getting there and a hard time with interdepartmental things. What kind of support can you provide to help them keep the job? Most of the time, when you start a new job, the whole approach is you're on probation.
Right.
Yeah.
You got 90 days.
You got to prove yourself. And
That's right.
for those of us who want to see these people succeed, we have to give them more support.
Yeah, that's interesting.
So let's shift gears a little bit. Who's that person who's had the most influence in your life?
Oh, Elizabeth Leonard. I already talked about my dad. Elizabeth Leonard was, I get emotional. She was really a mentor for me for about almost 20 years. She passed away a couple years ago. A sociology professor that developed a course called Family Violence. And when she retired, she sort of bequeathed that course to me. And I teach it. I have a really full schedule. I direct the Global Center, but I'm still a faculty member. And I am so committed to that particular course because I want students to have an understanding of what happened to people who become so vulnerable to human trafficking. The story almost always goes back to their family of origin. And many times they were victims of neglect, of sexual abuse, of psychological abuse. And you mentioned 12, 14 as like an average age for entry. Well, if you think about it, when you start entering adolescence, you get that attitude where I don't have to take this anymore. I can take care of myself. And they run away, but they can't take care of themselves. And there's somebody who studied Maslow's hierarchy, literally, and studied child development that knows exactly what to say to that kid to recruit them and say, I'm going to take care of you. So Elizabeth Leonard walked me through some of my own family members' issues around family violence that were very connected to pornography.
Right.
And then taught me, and that's why she said, you could be the director. You have to get your PhD. And she said so. So I did. And I did my PhD research. I've just been so blessed. I was offered, I didn't even have to apply for it, a grant through the UK to do building capacity for women in higher education at a university in Iraq. And talk about working with women who have been oppressed, who have been victimized. And we now know, the whole story around the Yazidi women. And so I've been working in Iraq now for 10 years. I still work with women in higher education because when we look at the next generation, our educators are shaping how they approach treating women, treating children, treating their the least of these in their communities.
Yeah, that's huge. I mean, it's a big problem over there. And it's, their culture, their belief system, that's a heavy lift to change some of those dynamics, but it certainly starts with education, awareness, and trying to create some of those epiphanies. So as you think about your life and all the experiences you've had, what are one or two pearls of wisdom that you could share with the audience? If they did those one or two things, whether in their personal life or professional life, it would just make a huge difference.
Two things. First of all, even if you know the answer, shut up and let somebody else answer, because they may be a verbal processor and now they're going to actually discover things because you gave them space. You don't always have to be the one with the answer.
Right.
And you can comment and encourage that. So I think helping other people be better is part of why I have success, because I'm looking at how I can promote my students, how I can give them opportunities to be the voice. My Live to Free student mobilization team from Vanguard went to New York City for Strike Out Slavery there a couple months, into Kansas City, and people said, "Why didn't you go?" It's like, because I want my students to have that experience. And there's only enough money for 2 tickets, and I want my students to do that.
Nice.
And secondly, the value of overlapping networks. I studied William Wilberforce and his strategy for ending the transatlantic slave trade. And I was convinced that you have to have networks that include government, the faith-based community, the social services, leaders who are from very diverse backgrounds. And if you think about what happens when you have overlapping networks, network is about a net, it creates a safety net for the most vulnerable. And the thinner that is, the more likely people are to fall through that.
Right.
My big conference that I do every year since 2007 is called Ensure Justice. And it's from Proverbs 31:8, where it says, "Be a voice for those who have no voice, semicolon." So you can't just talk about it. The rest of the sentence is, "Ensure justice, make things right for those being crushed."
Beautiful.
And that is my...
And when is this conference every year? What year? What month?
Every year, it's the first Friday and Saturday in March. So this coming year, it will be March 6th and 7th. And our theme, we're going to look at where we've been, where we are, and where we're going, because it's the 20th anniversary of the passage of the Trafficking Victims Protection
Is this
Act
at Vanguard
in the US.
University? Or?
Vanguard University. And you can go to our website to get more information.
Fantastic. So if you can go back in time and give yourself advice, what would it be?
Oh, I love that question. My favorite song, literally, is Mercy Me's Dear Younger Me. And one of the wisest things in there is the question that if I hadn't gone down some of those roads, would I be who I am today? And so I think the advice I would give myself would be, don't think that you haven't done anything because of where you are right now. There is more time, and you are in the process of becoming. I can't imagine doing what I'm doing today without the very diverse background I have in nursing, in education, in working cross-culturally. I published a magazine for Greek women. If I hadn't had all of those opportunities, I might be a very kind kind of narrow-minded professor.
Kind of in a silo.
Maybe even a little bit ivory tower thing.
Yeah. And that happens all the time. We definitely know that. Before we ask the last question, I just want to point out that Dr. Morgan wrote a book on Simple Greek at Your Table. It's a cookbook. I leaf through it. It's amazing. It's like I said to her, it's like I can appreciate the art, the pictures, and the recipes in here. I could never put something like this together. So how can they get a copy of this cookbook?
You can email me at sandra.morgan@vanguard.edu. It was part of a project to raise funds for our legal services for girls in our work in Athens, Greece. So the money doesn't go to me. It goes to our project in Greece.
Important cause. So is there anything that you want to share with the audience that we haven't covered?
Oh, I believe that we have resources to help you study the issues, be a voice, and make a difference. You can go to our endinghumantrafficking.org podcast, which we were recently invited into the Library of Congress. You can listen to me while you're driving or stuck in traffic. And
what's the name of your podcast?
The endinghumantrafficking.org. And the reason why I say ending is because I used to be really big in English grammar. And I understand this is a process. Right. It's not an event. Right. We are not going to do something today that ends something.
So you don't say end, you say ending.
Ending. We are part of the process, and we're going to do as much as we can on our watch, and then we're handing it off to the next generation, and they are going to make big changes.
Absolutely. Sandie, thanks so much for coming on Beyond. This has been an enlightening conversation for me. I think a very important topic to get out and certainly be able to share with the world kind of who you are and what drove you to become what you became. So thank you so much.
Thank you for the opportunity.
You bet. That's it from Beyond. You can learn more about the show at Beyond Ben Bobo on YouTube or go to our website, beyondbenbobo.com. And thanks for tuning in. Remember, until next time, becoming is better than being. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Enjoyed it.
All right.
When we founded Straddling in 1975, we made a commitment to helping our clients to succeed and create opportunities for business growth throughout California and beyond. Our people share cutting-edge focus in guiding the critical transactions and disputes of our clients. And we've developed a deep bench of contacts and resources to get the job done. As trusted advisors to technology, life science, software, and medical device companies, we've invested in building our expertise, developing the best of legal talent, and the readiness to serve the business community. From our commitment to our clients to our deep involvement in the communities we serve, we understand our job is your success.